The day I discovered my wife's infidelity was one of those days you remember in vivid detail, as if the universe has etched it into your mind with the precision of a scalpel. It was a Saturday, a day that had once been filled with promise and the small joys of life, sleeping in, lazy breakfasts and plans for the afternoon. But that morning, everything shifted, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. I had come home early from work, my mind racing with thoughts of what I would surprise her with. A nice dinner, perhaps a bottle of wine. As I walked through the front door, I was greeted by an odd silence that instantly set my nerves on edge. The usual sounds of our home, the soft hum of the television, the clinking of dishes, were absent. I called out for her, my voice echoing through the empty rooms, but there was no reply. I made my way to the bedroom, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. The door was slightly ajar and I pushed it open, expecting to find her lounging on the bed, maybe reading or scrolling through her phone. Instead, what I found shattered my world into a million pieces. There was a man in our bed. Not just any man, but a well-known motivational speaker, someone whose face graced the covers of self-help books and whose voice filled the airwaves with promises of success and happiness. He was wrapped in the sheets, a smug smile plastered on his face as he looked up at me. And there beside him was my wife, her expression shifting from surprise to horror as she realized the gravity of the situation. Time stood still. I felt as though I were watching a slow-motion train wreck, unable to intervene as the reality of my life came crashing down. My heart raced, and a mix of anger, disbelief, and betrayal surged through me. I had always trusted her, always believed in the bond we shared. How could she do this to me, to us? "Get out," I managed to say, my voice hoarse, filled with a mixture of rage and hurt. I didn't know what I wanted to scream at that moment, but I knew I needed to expel the man from my life, from my home. The motivational speaker didn't move, still lounging in my bed, as if it were his right. "Listen, man, it's not what it looks like," he began, but I cut him off. "Shut up, just get out now." My voice had a sharpness to it that surprised even me. I could feel a storm brewing inside, a tempest that threatened to consume me. My wife tried to rise, to explain, to plead, but I couldn't hear her over the pounding of my heart. The betrayal felt like a dagger twisting in my gut. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to do anything to alleviate the pain that was starting to overwhelm me. Instead, I took a deep breath and stepped back, forcing myself to leave the room. I needed air, space to think. I stumbled into the living room, my mind racing with thoughts that spiraled out of control. How long had this been going on? Was I blind to the signs? I felt like a fool, a man who had trusted blindly while his world crumbled around him. The weight of betrayal crashed down on me like a tidal wave, and I could hardly breathe. As I stood there, I realized that this wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about him, the man who had stolen my life and my trust. He preached about love, integrity, and success, yet here he was, tangled in sheets with my wife, a hypocrite of the highest order. In that moment, I knew I had to act. I would make sure he never inspired anyone again. After the confrontation, I found myself wandering aimlessly through the house, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. My mind was a chaotic storm of thoughts and emotions, each crashing into the other with a ferocity that made it hard to breathe. I felt betrayed, hurt, and above all, furious. How could she do this to me? How could she choose him, a man who made a living preaching about authenticity and connection, over our life together? I kept replaying the scene in my head, the image of her laughter with him, the tenderness in her eyes, the way she had looked at me just days before. Had it all been a lie? The thought twisted like a knife in my gut. I remembered the moments we had shared, the dreams we had built together, the promises we had made. Now they felt like ghosts, haunting me, reminders of a love that had been so easily cast aside. I sat down on the edge of the couch, my hands trembling as I buried my face in my palms. I felt small, diminished, as if the very foundation of my identity had been stripped away. I was no longer the husband, the partner who had stood by her side through thick and thin. I was just a man whose heart had been shattered, left to pick up the pieces alone. Then there was him, the motivational speaker. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me every time I thought of his smug smile, the way he had lounged in my bed as if he belonged there. He was everything I despised about the self-help industry: the false promises, the empty platitudes, the pretense of being a guide to a better life while engaging in the most destructive behavior. How could he look at himself in the mirror, knowing he had betrayed not just me, but also the very ideals he claimed to uphold? I felt a rush of anger directed at him, a man who had taken advantage of my trust, who had invaded my life without second thought. But alongside that anger was a creeping sense of inadequacy. What had I done wrong? Had I not been enough for her? Was I not the man she needed? The questions swirled in my mind, each one digging deeper into my already fragile self-worth. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that her infidelity was a reflection of her shortcomings, not mine. But the nagging doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. I felt like a failure, not just as a husband but as a man. The very core of my identity felt shaken, and I was left grappling with the remnants of who I thought I was. As the hours passed, I found myself pacing the floors, the anger evolving into something darker, a desire for revenge. It was a dangerous thought, but it took root in my mind, growing stronger with each passing moment. I envisioned him, smiling on stage, inspiring crowds with his hollow words, while I sat in the audience, feeling the sting of betrayal all over again. The idea of him continuing to spread his toxic message while I suffered felt unbearable. I thought about how many people looked up to him, how many lives he touched with his insincere advice. The thought of him continuing to thrive while I was left in ruins ignited a fire within me. I didn't just want to confront him. I wanted to dismantle everything he had built. I wanted him to feel the weight of his actions, to face the consequences of his betrayal. But as the anger coursed through me, I also felt a flicker of doubt. Was revenge the answer? Would it bring me peace, or would it only deepen my pain? I wrestled with these thoughts, the internal conflict raging within me. Part of me wanted to rise above it all, to walk away and reclaim my dignity. But another part craved justice, a reckoning that would leave a mark on the man who had shattered my life. In the end, I realized that I was at a crossroads. I could either succumb to the darkness of my emotions or channel them into something that would empower me. The choice was mine, and as I made that decision, I felt a surge of resolve. I would not be a victim. I would take control of my narrative. I would make sure that he never inspired anyone again. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, each one more intense than the last. I oscillated between anger and despair, but the seed of revenge had taken root in my mind, and it began to grow into a plan. I found myself waking up at odd hours, my mind racing with ideas as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The image of my wife with him haunted me, but it was the thought of him continuing to live his life as if nothing had happened that fueled my desire for retribution. I started to gather information about the motivational speaker, whose name was Jason Reed. The more I learned about him, the more my resolve hardened. He was a man who thrived on the adoration of others, a self-made guru who had built an empire on the backs of people seeking hope and inspiration. But beneath the surface, I could see the cracks. His personal life was riddled with rumors of infidelity and arrogance. I dug deeper, researching his past, his public appearances, and the people he surrounded himself with. I discovered that he had a reputation for being charming and persuasive, but also for being ruthless when it came to maintaining his image. That was my entry point. I realized that if I wanted to dismantle his reputation, I needed to play the game he had mastered. I would expose the truth behind the facade he presented to the world. I spent hours online, reading articles, watching his speeches, and even listening to testimonials from people who had attended his seminars. It was infuriating to hear how he preached about integrity and authenticity while living a life that was anything but. I began to compile a dossier of evidence: social media posts, videos, interviews, and articles that hinted at his questionable morals. With each piece I collected, my anger became more focused, more purposeful. But the real breakthrough came when I learned about an upcoming event where Jason would be the keynote speaker. It was a large conference, attended by thousands, and it presented the perfect opportunity for me to execute my plan. I envisioned a scenario where I could expose him in front of an audience, where his carefully crafted image would crumble under the weight of the truth. The thought sent a thrill through me, a rush of adrenaline that drowned out the lingering doubts in my mind. However, I knew I had to be strategic. I couldn't just charge in and confront him. I needed to gather more evidence to ensure that what I revealed would be indisputable. I began reaching out to former employees and attendees of his seminars, people who had experienced his charisma firsthand, but had also seen the darker side of his persona. I wanted to hear their stories, to collect testimonials that would paint a fuller picture of who he truly was. As I spoke to these individuals, I found a surprising sense of camaraderie. Many had felt manipulated or betrayed by him, and they were eager to share their experiences. Their stories fueled my fire, and I began to see my mission not just as revenge, but as a form of justice. I was taking a stand against someone who had hurt not just me, but many others who had fallen under his spell. The more I invested in this plan, the more I felt a sense of purpose returning to my life. I was no longer just a man whose heart had been broken. I was someone who was fighting back, reclaiming my narrative. I started to feel empowered, like I was taking control of a situation that had spiraled out of my hands. I was no longer a victim. I was a force to be reckoned with. As the day of the conference approached, I meticulously crafted my strategy. I would attend the event, blending in with the crowd while keeping my eyes peeled for the right moment to strike. My heart raced with anticipation, and I could almost feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was ready to expose him, to hold him accountable for his actions, not just to me, but to everyone he had misled. But deep inside, I grappled with an unsettling truth. Was I really doing this for justice, or was it simply revenge masked as righteousness? I pondered whether the satisfaction of seeing him fall would truly heal the wounds in my heart. Yet, as I prepared for the confrontation, I pushed those thoughts aside. This was my moment, and I was determined to seize it. I took a deep breath and steeled myself for what lay ahead. I was ready to face him, ready to ensure he would never inspire anyone again. The day of the conference arrived with an electric buzz in the air. I stood outside the venue, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. The building loomed before me, a glass and steel structure that radiated success and ambition. It was a fitting backdrop for a man like Jason Reed, who thrived in environments that celebrated aspiration and achievement. I took a moment to collect myself, reminding myself of my purpose. I wasn't just attending a conference, I was about to expose a fraud. As I entered the venue, I was struck by the sheer number of people gathered to hear him speak. The crowd was a sea of eager faces, all drawn in by the promise of inspiration and transformation. I felt a pang of bitterness at the sight. How could they not see through the veneer of charm? I navigated through the throng, my heart racing as I approached the main auditorium. Once inside, I found a seat near the front. The stage was set, adorned with bright lights and banners displaying Jason's name alongside motivational slogans. I could feel the energy in the room, a mix of hope and anticipation that only intensified as the clock ticked closer to his entrance. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the evidence I had gathered, the stories I had collected. I was ready. As the lights dimmed and the audience erupted in applause, I felt a knot of anxiety twist in my stomach. Jason stepped onto the stage, exuding charisma and confidence. He waved to the crowd, his smile radiant as he began to speak. His voice was smooth, his words carefully crafted to resonate with the audience. I could see why people were drawn to him. He had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. But beneath the surface charm, I was focused on my goal. I had my phone ready, the recordings of interviews and testimonials stored within, waiting for the right moment to unveil the truth. As he spoke about authenticity and integrity, my anger bubbled just beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. I was determined to show everyone the man behind the mask. After several minutes of his speech, I decided it was time to make my move. I stood up, my heart pounding as I shouted, "Jason Reed, you're a fraud." The words escaped my lips before I could second-guess myself, and the room fell silent as heads turned in my direction. Jason's smile faltered, and the audience gasped, a mix of shock and curiosity rippling through the crowd. I took a step forward, adrenaline surging through me. "You stand up here preaching about integrity while you're sleeping with someone's wife. How can you inspire anyone when you're living a lie?" The tension in the room was palpable. Jason's expression shifted from surprise to anger, and he attempted to regain control. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." But I wasn't done. I pulled out my phone and began playing the recordings I had gathered. Testimonials from former attendees who had felt manipulated and betrayed by him filled the auditorium. "Listen to their stories. This man doesn't care about you. He only cares about his image and his bank account." Gasps and murmurs spread through the audience as people began to realize the weight of my claims. I could see a few familiar faces in the crowd, people I had spoken to, who were now nodding in agreement. The tide was turning, and the energy in the room shifted from admiration to disbelief. Jason tried to regain control, waving his hands dismissively. "This is absurd. I help people, I change lives." But his voice was strained, and the confidence he had exuded moments before was crumbling. I pressed on, my voice rising above the chaos. "You don't help people, you exploit them. You preach about honesty while you manipulate and deceive. This is who you really are." I felt a surge of power as I exposed him, each word fueled by the pain he had caused me and countless others. The audience was now divided, some people visibly shaken by the revelations, others still clinging to their idol, desperate to defend him. But I could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade, the fear creeping into his eyes as he realized that his reputation was on the line. Security personnel moved toward me, but I stood my ground, determined to finish what I had started. I had come too far to back down now. "You can't silence the truth, Jason. You need to be held accountable for your actions." As the security team reached me, I felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. I knew I might be escorted out, but I had made my point. I had shattered the illusion he had built, and I could see the uncertainty in his expression. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, and it filled me with a sense of satisfaction. As they led me away from the stage, I glanced back at Jason, who was now trying to regain his composure, but the damage was done. The audience was buzzing with confusion and disbelief, and I could feel the shift in the atmosphere. I had taken my stand, and I knew that I had done something significant, something that would resonate far beyond that moment. As I was ushered out of the auditorium, I felt a mix of relief and adrenaline. I had faced my demons and fought back against the man who had shattered my life. I didn't know what would happen next, but I felt a sense of empowerment that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I had taken control of my narrative, and I was ready to face whatever came next. As I was escorted out of the venue, my heart raced with a mix of adrenaline and anxiety. The confrontation had been both liberating and terrifying. I had exposed Jason Reed, but I also knew there would be consequences for my actions. The thrill of standing up for myself began to wane, replaced by the reality of what I had just done. I had turned my pain into a public spectacle, and now I was left to grapple with the fallout. Once outside, I took a moment to collect my thoughts. The sun shone brightly, almost mocking the turmoil inside me. People were streaming out of the auditorium, some with expressions of shock, others with curiosity. I could only imagine the conversations happening behind me. Had I truly made a difference, or had I merely created chaos? In the following days, the fallout was immediate and intense. News outlets picked up the story, and articles began to circulate online. "Motivational speaker exposed for infidelity," read the headlines. I felt a rush of satisfaction mingled with anxiety as I realized that my actions had sparked a firestorm. Jason's carefully curated image was crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny, and I knew I had played a part in that. But with the spotlight on him, I found myself thrust into the narrative as well. Some people hailed me as a hero, a whistleblower who had taken a stand against hypocrisy. Others, however, labeled me a bitter husband seeking revenge. The comments online were brutal. Some praised my courage, while others vilified me for airing dirty laundry in public. I was no longer just a man seeking justice. I had become a figure of controversy. My wife, too, became embroiled in the chaos. She reached out to me, her voice shaky as she tried to explain. "I'm so sorry, I didn't think it would come to this," she pleaded. I felt a wave of anger rise within me at her words. Did she think that an apology could erase the betrayal? I couldn't look at her without feeling the sting of her infidelity. "We can talk about this later," I said tersely, cutting her off. I didn't want to hear her excuses or justifications. My heart was still raw, and I needed space to process everything. She hung up, and I was left alone with my thoughts, feeling the weight of my actions pressing down on me. The ripple effects of my actions also reached Jason. As the media scrutiny intensified, his empire began to crumble. Events were canceled, sponsors pulled out, and his social media platforms were flooded with criticism. I watched from the sidelines, a mix of satisfaction and guilt washing over me. I had wanted justice, but I hadn't fully considered the implications of destroying a man's career. Was I any better than him? As I followed the unfolding drama, I began to feel an unsettling sense of emptiness. I had achieved my goal of exposing Jason, yet I found myself feeling hollow. The revenge I had sought had not filled the void left by my wife's betrayal. Instead, it had opened new wounds, and I was left grappling with the aftermath of my actions. Weeks passed, and I found myself in a state of limbo. My marriage was in tatters, and I was unsure of what to do next. I had fought back against the man who had wronged me, but in doing so, I had also lost a part of myself. I realized I needed to confront my feelings, not only about Jason but also about my wife and our relationship. I met with a therapist, hoping to find some clarity. Sitting in that small room, I began to unpack the emotional turmoil I had been through. I spoke about the betrayal, the anger, and the revenge. The therapist listened patiently, guiding me through the maze of my emotions. "What do you want for yourself now?" she asked gently. That question hit me like a jolt. I had been so focused on revenge that I hadn't thought about my own healing. I realized that I needed to prioritize my well-being, to reclaim my sense of self outside of the pain and betrayal. I had to decide whether I wanted to salvage my marriage or walk away from it entirely. In the weeks that followed, I began to focus on myself, slowly rebuilding my life. I took up new hobbies, reconnected with friends, and found solace in writing. I poured my thoughts onto the page, using my experiences as a cathartic release. It was through this process that I began to understand the importance of forgiveness, not just for my wife or Jason, but for myself. I had let anger consume me, and while it had fueled my actions, it had also isolated me from the healing I desperately needed. I started to envision a future where I could let go of the past, a future where I could define my happiness on my own terms. As I moved forward, I knew I had to confront my wife again. We needed to have an honest conversation about our relationship, about the betrayal, and about whether we could rebuild what had been lost. The journey ahead was uncertain, but I felt a sense of hope that had been absent for far too long. I had taken a stand against betrayal, but now it was time to take a stand for myself. The day I decided to meet with my wife again was one filled with trepidation. I had spent weeks reflecting on everything that had happened, and I knew that this conversation would be pivotal. I wanted to approach it with honesty and clarity, ready to address the wounds that had been inflicted on both of us. We met at a small cafe, a neutral ground where we could talk without the weight of our past looming over us. As I walked in, I spotted her sitting at a corner table, her hands nervously twisting a napkin. The sight of her brought back a flood of memories, the laughter, the shared dreams, the love that had once bound us together. But alongside those memories was the betrayal, a chasm that felt too vast to bridge. I took a seat across from her, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Finally, she broke the ice. "I'm so sorry for what happened," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to explain." I held up a hand, stopping her. Before you explain, I need you to understand something. I'm not here to rehash the past. What I want to know is if we can move forward. Can we rebuild what we had, or is this the end? Her eyes widened and I could see the tears welling up. I want to rebuild it. I made a terrible mistake and I've been reflecting on everything. I realize how much I've hurt you and I don't want to lose you. As she spoke, I felt a mix of anger and longing. I had spent so much time envisioning this moment, imagining the confrontation, but now that it was here, I found myself torn. I wanted to believe in her words, to trust that she was sincere, but the scars of betrayal ran deep. I don't know if I can trust you again, I admitted, my voice steady but filled with the weight of my emotions. What happened shattered my world. I felt like a fool for believing in you, for believing in us. I understand, she replied, her voice filled with remorse. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to show you that I can be the person you thought I was. I've been working on myself, on understanding why I made such a horrible choice. I listened, weighing her words carefully. Part of me wanted to reach out, to grasp at the remnants of our relationship, while another part of me warned against it. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. But I also realized that I had changed through this experience. I had fought back against betrayal and I had found a sense of empowerment that I hadn't known before. I need time, I finally said. I need to understand what I want. I want to focus on healing for both of us. But I can't promise that I'll be able to forgive you or that we can go back to how things were. Her face fell, but she nodded, understanding the weight of my words. I'm willing to wait. I want to do whatever it takes to make this right. I love you and I don't want to lose you. As we continued to talk, I felt the tension between us begin to ease. We discussed our feelings, the pain, and the possibility of moving forward. It was a long conversation filled with tears, honesty, and vulnerability. I could see that she was genuinely remorseful, and while the road ahead was uncertain, I felt a glimmer of hope. In the weeks that followed, we took small steps toward rebuilding our relationship. We started therapy together, learning to communicate openly and honestly about our feelings. It was awkward at first, but slowly we began to forge a new connection, one built on transparency and understanding. I also continued to focus on my own healing. I poured my energy into writing, using it as an outlet to process my emotions. I began to reflect on my experiences, not just as a means of revenge, but as a journey of self-discovery. I learned that while betrayal had changed me, it had also given me the opportunity to grow and redefine my sense of self. As time passed, I found that the anger I had harbored began to dissipate. I realized that holding on to that anger only kept me tethered to the past. Forgiveness became a gradual process, not just for my wife but for myself. I had to forgive myself for the pain I had allowed to fester, for the anger that had consumed me, and for the choices I had made in the heat of betrayal. In the end, I learned that life is not just about the moments of joy and love, but also about the challenges that test our resilience. I had faced betrayal and emerged stronger, and while the scars would remain, they were a testament to my journey. I had taken a stand, not only against the man who had wronged me, but also for my own happiness. As I sat down to write my reflections, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I was ready to embrace the future, whatever it may hold. I had learned that true strength comes from within, and I was determined to build a life that honored my journey, a life where I could define my happiness on my own terms. With that realization, I closed my notebook, feeling a sense of closure. I had faced the darkness and emerged into the light. The journey ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to embrace it with open arms.